Thank you so much for watching my show and listening if you're on the podcast version. My show, William Wallace for America, is brought to you by Bond Arms, My Pillow, and also Patriot Mobile, where if you go to my website at williamwallace.net, you're not only going to find links to their sites and some promo codes, you'll find some other sponsors that make my show possible. Please visit my site at williamwallace.net, where I'm always talking about freedom, liberty, and where America is under attack. And with me today is a guest that is going to do exactly that for us. Sam Faddis, retired CIA, and you have And Magazine on Substack. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me, man. Thank you very much.
Well, when I had the privilege of meeting with you in DC and finding out a lot of the information that you have and that you're not afraid to talk about it, I wanted to get you on my platform because I think more Americans need to hear the great information you have and where America is under attack. So let's get started with the hot question. Where is America under attack the most right now, Sam?
God, everywhere. I mean, look, it is really difficult to throw your arms around that problem, right? I mean, we have the most disastrous administration in American history in power, and all across the board, we are just facing enormous problems, right? I mean, we have no border. We're actively moving people into the country. We're the Iranians are either already have nuclear weapons or are days away from having nuclear weapons. The Chinese are on the verge of taking Taiwan. I mean, we're not only threatened abroad, we're threatened right here on our own soil. Is the unfortunate truth.
So before I ask you some of the other questions, I want people to understand the magnitude of your information. The relevance that you have here. How many years were you at the CIA?
So I was an Army officer. I got out of the Army. I went into the CIA. I was undercover almost all that time abroad for 20 years. And then I spent another 10 years after I left CIA working with other portions of the intelligence community in that capacity. Mostly I built and ran the training courses to train operators to go downrange and do what I had been doing.
When you say downrange, you mean like like out in the field where the either where fighting is or where the activity is. We'll say where the hot spots are.
100% to go overseas. I mean, we also trained. I've worked with virtually every component of the intelligence community, training their people to go do those things overseas. Yeah.
And let me say this: some people might ask, what gives you the ability or the right or the feeling to be able to come out and I don't want to say expose because as we ask some questions, I'm sure there's gonna be some things you can't answer that you probably realize put your people that are still in the service, you don't want to put them at risk. But then you might say some things that some people say, wow, that's pretty, that's pretty important to know, or it's not, so that's well known to the public. But what makes you want to get this information out right now?
Well, look, I believe that we are threatened. I believe the intelligence agencies are supposed to, they exist for a reason, right? And that's to serve the American people and keep us safe. I would also add that I believe that the vast majority of people that are in the intelligence agencies, including CIA, are good folks. They aren't there for the money. They aren't there for the public recognition. They're there because they want to do their jobs. And so we need to know what's broken, and we need to know how to fix it, and we need to get it fixed as quickly as possible. So that's my motive, pure and simple.
Do you feel you're kind of shining the light more on the people at the top? You said that most of the bureau is made up of good people. So does that mean kind of like the political appointees at the top that are appointed by administrations that we may or may not agree with? Are they the guys that are kind of not always doing the right thing, or they're the ones that are causing the lower level guys to not be able to do the good work that they have potential to do?
Well, it is definitely true that the entire intelligence community has been politicized. So we have, the intelligence community's job is to tell the truth. That's the way I always looked at it, right? I'm on the ground.
Right.
My job is to gather intelligence. And then I give it to Washington. And then a policymaker decides what to do with it. I don't shade what I say based on whether they're Democrats or Republicans or whatever they are or what they would like to hear. I just tell the truth as best I can discern it. So, in that sense, you must be apolitical. It's definitely true that that is not the case anymore, and there is massive political interference. Do you have other problems? Sure. You got people internally who should be standing up to that, who should be saying, I'm not going along with your agenda. And if you could force me, here's my resignation, I'm walking out the door. So, it's not as simple. I mean, as always, you have the folks who are pushing an agenda, and then you have the folks that are too weak to stand up to the agenda. You also obviously have a lot of people just trapped in the ranks, right? You're a GS-13. You don't like what's happening. You're still trying to do your job as best you can. And you're praying to God every night that somebody will show up and fix it. And before it's too late. So I have
See,
always said, and I will continue to say, I think if you went into a place like CIA, this would go for agencies all across the intelligence community, and you actually began to fix things in a real way, throw out the political hacks and get things back on track. I think you frankly would have people standing in the hallways cheering. I think you got a lot of good Americans there who are just praying every day that that's going to happen.
and I guess to some extent, the guys that are kind of stuck in the middle, as you said, those GS-13s, that don't like what's going on on the upper levels, they're there hanging out with their friends that maybe some they can be open with and say, hey, look, I don't like what's going on. Some they can't. They kind of, I guess, see that it's easier for them if they know if they stay in, they have a better chance at fixing something than if they get out.
Well, I think a lot of people get to this point. Look, when I decided to retire from the agency, I did not retire from CIA because I had to. In fact, after I submitted my retirement papers, they called me in and asked me to pick them up and promised me promotion, um, and onward assignment. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't consider it for a moment because I loved the job. But I reached the decision that I was walking because I personally had decided you couldn't fix it from inside. That was the basic conversation I'd had with myself, and it was like, no, you cannot fix it from inside, and the price of staying here is becoming part of the problem. So everybody wrestles with that individually, right? And yes, there are guys and gals who continue to fight and say, yeah, it's terrible, but I'm going to keep swinging and stay here and hope I can make an impact.
Or hope that the politics change and the right people get put in at the top to be able to help
Yes.
connect the top and the middle a little bit. So when I asked you in the beginning what are our biggest threats on America, I kind of jumped the shark, so to speak, real quick, because I kind of wanted to give people an insight of what we were going to talk about, in our time here, and to that point. You mentioned, China and for Taiwan, you mentioned our border, the Iranians, let's go through some of these threats, on the top three threats that you think there are to America right now. And that's also to our threats to freedom. And can you kind of explain why? I mean, sometimes the common sense answer we realize, but hey, you're in CIA and you're intelligence, you have a deeper set of information, I think, than most people will realize what they're going to hear today.
Well, look, on a strategic level, clearly the biggest threat is communist China, right? The Chinese Communist Party, and we're digging our own grave. I mean, to put it bluntly, right? We made this decision to climb into bed economically with these guys decades ago, and we sold it to the American people that the idea was somehow communist China would democratize and liberalize and become just like us. I don't know if anybody ever really believed that or if they just used that as a line to feed to the American people. But obviously, anybody who can read or has eyes knows that that didn't happen. And what we did was we made our mortal enemy much, much stronger. And these guys already have their hooks into us, right? I mean, they, one way or the other, have bought a huge number of individuals. Either, I don't necessarily mean they formally recruited them as spies, but one way or the other, they have huge number of influential Americans who are now so in bed with them economically and making so much money there and have so much invested that they won't stand up to Beijing. And the Chinese are looting us of our technology. The military advantage we have is that our technology is better. Our military is not bigger. We're not, and they understand that. They say that outright. They're stealing everything that isn't nailed down and some things that are. So they're taking away that advantage. They're growing bigger and stronger all the time. They're buying, our government officials, our corporate leaders. That, in effect, they're at war with us already, and we're losing. The solution to that is a fundamental change in our philosophy, right? Disengage economically from communist China and treat them as an enemy. This administration is going precisely the opposite direction. The Iranians, look, Iran, obviously, when I'm talking about these countries, I'm not talking about the people, right?
Right.
We're not talking about being enemies with 1 billion Chinese.
It's kind of like politically in our own country. I don't have anything against most liberal people or most Democrats, because many liberals and Democrats, are nice people. Some of them are more conservative than some of my Republican friends. I have a problem with the far left and the far right politicians that are dividing us up. So to your point, it's that leadership, what you're talking about.
Well, so I mean, look, there are 1 billion plus Chinese who wake up basically every day in a gulag, right? I mean, all of China is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. So, who are the first victims of the Chinese Communist Party? The Chinese people, obviously. So, in any event, I just make clear: look, this is not about being against some group as a whole, a population. The Iranians, okay. Great civilization, fantastic people. I've known a lot of Iranians and worked with a lot of Iranians. The Ayatollahs who run Iran have an apocalyptic worldview. They don't seek coexistence. They don't want to get along. They don't want to just have their own space. That may be the way most Americans think. This is not the way these guys think. They believe this is the end of times. They see everything in expressly religious terms. Most Americans probably don't think like that anymore. But these guys do. They believe it's the end of days. They believe we're about to enter Armageddon for real. Not like, that's not a metaphor. This is the end of days. The Mahdi is coming. This Islamic Superman, they think, is going to reappear. And there's going to be a final apocalyptic struggle. And when it's all done, they're the only ones who survive. So I'm not saying I believe that or most Americans believe that. I'm just saying that's the way the guys who run that country think.
And
so
it's
that's
interesting
the context in which these guys are either about to have an atomic bomb or may in fact already have an atomic bomb and just haven't revealed it. But everybody, all the experts say, in effect, they have to be treated as a nuclear power now. In other words, we have allowed this to go so far.
Mm-hmm.
We no longer have the capacity to know precisely when they get a nuke, and we sure as heck don't have the capacity to stop them anymore. So you got a bunch of guys who want to bring on the end of the world for real, who are about to be or are already in possession of nuclear weapons, and they already have the missiles and they already have the planes. So they're not going to acquire those weapons and then just sort of sit quietly with those weapons. You may wish they would, and you may think even a rational person would, but that's because you don't look at the problem. We don't look at the problem the way they do. Third thing I would throw in, you said 3 things. in general, terrorism, right? The Biden administration wants you, after the fall of Afghanistan, to just forget about terrorism. Well, Afghanistan is now a giant terrorist superstate. They are lashed up, the Taliban, with every major Islamic terrorist group on the planet. They are so tight with Al Qaeda, which is there in vast numbers, that there are actually members of Al Qaeda, senior leaders, who hold formal positions in the Taliban government. So there are governors of entire provinces in Afghanistan. So they're Taliban governors, because that's the government now, but they are actually senior members of Al Qaeda. So these two groups are, Al Qaeda didn't go away. They're bigger and stronger than ever. And now they're literally joined at the hip with the Taliban. So those guys' ideology didn't change. I mean, the ideology that led them to take down the World Trade Center and attack the Pentagon hasn't morphed at all. The only thing that's changed is they now have a massive platform, bigger, more prosperous, more powerful than they ever had before, from which to launch those attacks. Our response to that has been to leave Afghanistan and then give up control of our borders, so we no longer have any ability to limit who enters our country.
So tell me, the Taliban. You mentioned Iranians, the Ayatollahs, and you mentioned the Taliban leaders. Are they connected in any way other than just by their faith, or are they do they plot together, so to speak? Are they both because they both have the same faith? Are they plotting together for the end of the world, or does one just have a different mission than the other? The Iranians say, "Hey, look, we got bombs. We're going to end it," and the Taliban just says, "Hey, look, we just kind of want to have these little provinces and and have some terrorism going on." I mean, I'm not making light of that by saying
Right.
it that way, but I mean, and then the other thing, the answer after that is, I had heard China moved into Afghanistan real heavily. So those, what's your answers on those?
Well, what you got, as is typical in the world, you got an interplay of a whole bunch of factors here, right? The Iranians are Shia. So in the Muslim world, speaking very broadly, there's a huge division between Shia and Sunnis. I don't want to get lost in the explanation for that. It all has to do
Right.
with stuff that happened 1,500 years ago and who's the legitimate successor to Muhammad. The point is, they're mortal enemies, kind of like Protestants and Catholics, but not Protestants and Catholics today where nobody cares. Protestant and Catholics in the Middle Ages, where you would sack a city and kill everybody because you're on the wrong side of this divide. So to that extent, the Taliban and the Al Qaeda, these are all Sunni Muslims. The Iranians are Shia. So they are kind of enemies, well, they are enemies in that sense. But as is often the case in the world, enemies decide to cooperate against because they have a mutual enemy that's more important. So we have seen in the past that Iran has given safe haven to Al Qaeda leaders. They let Al Qaeda leaders escape from Afghanistan by crossing Iranian territory. So even though there's this hostility, yeah, when it comes to the mutual enemy, which would be the great Satan, which would be us, that doesn't preclude them cooperating. So I know as fact that American military equipment that we abandoned in Afghanistan and left to the Taliban has made its way into Iranian hands, including a number of very sophisticated things we left behind, where we not only were they given to the Iranians, but in some cases where they weren't given outright to the Iranians by the Taliban let the Iranians come and examine them with the goal of being able to reverse engineer our equipment. So even when they weren't going to give it to the Iranians, they would allow Iranian technicians to come. So the Chinese 100% are on the ground in Afghanistan. They have access to Bagram Air Base, which is a massive military. It was a Russian base originally. We took it over during the war. We expanded it dramatically. It's a massive facility. The Chinese operate out of there now. And they're also on the ground in Afghanistan pursuing mining concessions, a lot of minerals in Afghanistan. So there's a lash up in cooperation. Again, why? Because they have a common enemy, and that's us. One of the many impacts of that is when the Chinese are there and pursuing these mining concessions, that just means boatloads of money handed to the Taliban, which they will use to do anything. So the Chinese will go there and mine whatever mineral, and the Taliban will rake in the bucks, which they will obviously, they won't use it, for charitable purposes. They will put it to work on spreading violence across the
I,
planet. I mean,
I had heard that China was actually even the poppy seed that's only grown in Afghanistan isn't there a product they're used to make fentanyl that they're using basically send across our border and kill us?
well, I haven't heard about the connection between fentanyl and the poppy seed, but it is without question that the Chinese, I mean, over 100,000 people die a year of fentanyl poisoning in the United States. That's an old number, so I'm sure the number is higher now.
Exactly.
All the precursor chemicals for the manufacture of fentanyl, most of which is done in Mexico now, all the precursor chemicals come from China. Now, this is communist China, where you can't sneeze without them knowing about it, where they monitor everything you do. So, everybody can do their own math on whether they really think that massive quantities of precursor chemicals somehow magically leave communist China and go to the drug cartels in Mexico without the Chinese Communist Party's permission and, if you will, sponsorship, right?
Right.
That doesn't happen. In other words, at a minimum, if they wanted to stop it, they could stop it tomorrow. And they don't want to stop it because it's another part of what they're doing to us. They're killing Americans and destroying American society. It's basically a WMD attack that's ongoing that the Chinese are behind.
You had mentioned China having labs in America, when I met with you, and
Right.
I'd like for you to share that with the listeners because this goes back to why we should fear China buying up our land in America. But can you explain what you told me before about why they're buying our land in America and about the labs that that you know of?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's just say everything that I'm going to talk about is occurring against the backdrop of COVID. So if you have any common sense and you're not just willfully blind, by this point, you have to figure it out that COVID is a bioengineered organism, a virus that is the product of gain of function research. In other words, Chinese scientists took a virus and made it more dangerous to humans. And they did that in the Wuhan lab. There are actually more than one Wuhan lab, but let's just say they did that in Wuhan. Now, we can debate whether they then deliberately released it or whether it jumped the fence because they're incredibly sloppy. It doesn't matter. I mean, in the sense that they messed with this thing. They made it more dangerous. It got loose. At a minimum, they then lied to us and claimed that they hadn't done any of this. And we just saw what is a relatively mild disease, with all respect to anybody who died from it. This isn't smallpox. It doesn't kill 1 out of every 3 people. And it wrecked the world economy, and it knocked our country on its butt and led to, civil liberties being suspended.
Mm-hmm.
All of that happened. So what we ought to be, where I'm going with that is we ought to be looking at that thinking, all right, so we just saw what could happen with this disease. We ought to now be really running like hell to make sure we can't possibly suffer that fate again. Like, we ought to be controlling our borders and monitoring people for diseases they have when they come in. We're not, of course, doing any of those things. We're not fixing, having seen how woefully unprepared we were and how counterproductive everything we did was in, if you will, a dry run. We are actually not preparing for a future pandemic, which could be a disease like smallpox. Smallpox kills literally 1 out of every 3 people it affects. So you're not talking about COVID. You're talking about entire cities being depopulated. Okay, that's the reality. So we're not doing anything about that. In this context, a lab was discovered relatively recently, within the last year, out in California, in an industrial area, completely off the books, not registered as a lab. Some business inspector was in the area and walking by this building that was supposed to be uninhabited and not in use, and discovered that there was like a garden hose or something hooked up outside. It was something totally incidental and trivial. And this city employee starts scratching his head and starts knocking on doors. What he discovers is a completely off the books lab run by a Chinese company. And inside, they got entire freezers filled with unknown organisms, one of which just has a piece of tape on it, and it literally says Ebola. That's the only thing it says. And when you open it, it's filled with sealed packages of nobody knows, but since it says Ebola on the outside, that would suggest pretty strongly it's Ebola. They also found things like a whole bunch of these, what they call humanized mice. So when they're testing these organisms, trying to figure out how they will affect humans, there are special mice that have been bred whose respiratory system, when I say humanized, it's not like they got little human faces.
Right.
It's not like something out of, it means their respiratory systems and other systems have been modified to the point where they are susceptible to the same kind of diseases that would impact a human. So you test whether this thing would be lethal to a person or how they would contract it by infecting these guys. One of the things, so there are a whole bunch of those. There were like thousands of them, I think. One of the things is that those mice, it's not like you go to the pet store and buy that thing for a few bucks. Each one of those, I don't remember the exact figure, but they're ridiculously expensive. So, in other words, this was not an operation where somebody had invested $50 in it. This was an operation where somebody had sunk millions of dollars into a completely off the books lab filled with all these dangerous organisms. And again, the humanized mice is indicative of there's some major bucks. And by the way, you can't just go buy them anywhere. So you got to tap into some limited suppliers that obviously only supply certain labs. And there's like a million questions here, right? By the way, right down the road from the lab is what's called a master fighter base for the U.S. Navy. So all of the F-18 aircraft in the Pacific Theater, so that's the Navy's primary strike fighter, like the plane that takes off from a carrier. If you're going to go hit a target and with planes coming off a U.S. Navy carrier, chances are overwhelming that's an F-18 aircraft that will deliver that ordnance. So those squadrons base out of this base near this lab. And then when a carrier deploys, they actually fly to the carrier and land. In other words, the pilots and the planes don't just sit on the carrier when it's important. They deploy with the carrier, but all of them, every one of those squadrons, the master base for them all, from which they all come, is right down the road from this lab.
So obviously, this is a reason why China is trying to buy up our land next to the lab, next to our military bases, because it's an easier way to take them out without ever firing a shot, literally.
Well, look, you could release from this lab, for instance, a disease that wouldn't even have to kill most people, just incapacitate most people, and take the pilots for these squadrons offline. I mean, you could also do things that are much worse, but that alone means you have effectively taken away the United States Navy's virtually its entire strike capability in the Pacific Theater by releasing a disease into the surrounding area where all these pilots live. But here's the really terrifying, I mean, all of that is bad enough. The really terrifying part is that nobody seems to care. Like I said, there was a freezer filled literally like a big chest freezer, like you might have in your basement. It's got a label and it says Ebola, handwritten on a piece of tape. I'm not kidding. And it's filled with sealed packages of something like envelopes. So the CDC shows up and they never tested anything in that lab. They showed no interest. They didn't take these things and find out what it was. There's been no investigation. So first of all, nobody, all the questions that anybody listening to me talk about this would now have, like, was this a deliberate biolab? Was it some kind of fly-by-night business? Yeah. Whatever theory you can come up with, the answer is we don't know. And we're not going to find out because nobody's investigating. But the biggest question, I guess, is, okay, is that assuming that it's possible that this is a really nefarious thing with the intent to do something like take all our fighter jet, all our F-18s in the Pacific Theater offline, would be really nice to know, is that the only such lab in the country?
And if there's one, there's got to be more, because where there's smoke, there's got to be fire.
Could be 24, right? But the thing is, nobody is investigating that. There is no ongoing investigation. CDC didn't test anything. They showed no interest. In fact, when the local folks, as I said, the local city people just kind of stumbled into this thing based on literally a business inspector who's not looking for biolabs. Just they start calling CDC. The first few times they called CDC, and I swear I'm not making this up, they hung up on them. They were like, what do you want us to do about it, man? Who cares? Leave us alone. So when it's all done, all we know is more or less what I've told you.
So the feds didn't even get involved in this.
Say again?
The feds or any federal agencies didn't even get involved.
Well, finally CDC came out, but they showed no interest in doing anything. So they, I think, eventually hauled away these envelopes, for instance, and there were multiple freezers like this, and destroyed them, but never figured out what was in them, showed no interest. There is no ongoing investigation.
So the FBI didn't get involved. The CIA didn't get involved.
Nobody. And look, my last job before I left the CIA, I ran the terrorist weapons of mass destruction unit. So our job was to chase terrorist chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats worldwide. I will guarantee you that if we had seen a report on this discovery when I was there, we would have had people on an aircraft as fast as physically possible, flying to California, interfacing with the Bureau. What the heck? Like, bottom line, the bottom line is we must investigate and figure out what the heck is going on here. And if this is in fact a Chinese biolab with nefarious intent on U.S. soil, well, that's a big deal. And then the next step is what I indicated before. Are there others? Where are they? How many? What's, like, you don't.
And if they're doing this on a little small lab on a small scale, imagine what they're able to do when they buy up hundreds of acres of land, in the Midwest, and where they're not really, being watched. This is some pretty scary stuff, Sam, that you're making us aware of.
It's terrifying because, again, everybody just saw the impact of COVID, okay, which is basically a bad flu. It doesn't mean that it didn't kill some people. I have people have long COVID. I recognize that. It's not bubonic plague. It's not smallpox. I mean, the bubonic plague killed a third of the population of Europe in the 1300s. There are entire cities that effectively became ghost towns. That's why biological threats are supposed to be treated so seriously by the intelligence community, not because it's going to inconvenience you and you might have to wear a mask, assuming that does anything, because it can destroy the nation, kill, 100 million people. So you talk about farmland. We are also allowing Chinese biotech companies to come here, operate, and build giant facilities on our soil. There are a number of them operating where they engage in gain-of-function research and manufacture biological agents on our soil. Wow. So, you don't have to infect somebody in Wuhan. potentially and put them on a
Right.
plane. You just turn that biological agent loose right here in the United States on our soil.
In one place. You mentioned Taiwan earlier. Why why should the US be so worried if China takes over Taiwan? How is that a threat to America?
Well, I mean, there's some immediate practical concerns, right? Like virtually our entire economy these days runs on chips, that are, and all of the high end chips for your computers and your phones, and they like 85% of the world's supply, maybe more than that, comes out of Taiwan. So, I mean, there are a couple of things that come to mind there. First is we shouldn't tolerate that situation, right? We shouldn't be in a position of
Right.
being so that doesn't make any sense. We got to fix that, and there are some moves in that direction. But as of right now, that's the case. So if you cut off that supply, I mean, maybe people are like, okay, I won't look at my tablet or my iPhone. It's like, no, your entire world runs on chips now. I mean, you think you have $1 million in your 401k, what you have is an electronic record of money in a system somewhere, right? You don't have $1 million stacked up in a room someplace. So if the systems come down and the systems can't function, you don't have any money and you can't communicate and you can't do anything, right? Our whole world is moved.
Right.
So that's a big deal. The second thing I would say strategically is this. Ever since 1945, the Pacific Ocean has been in effect an American lake, right? The Seventh Fleet controls the Pacific Ocean. And while communist China is an enemy and North Korea is, all the rest of East Asia and the Pacific is free and independent, and they all look to the United States to guarantee that status quo continues, right? If the Chinese take Taiwan, that entire strategic reality just changed. I mean, if we allow the Chinese to take, let's put it this way, you're the Japanese and the Chinese take Taiwan, and the US watches and yawns and doesn't do anything. You don't wake up the next day thinking, I can continue doing business the way I've been doing business since 1945, which is understanding that
Right.
we live under the umbrella of American strategic protection. You recognize, no, we're on our own face to face with the dragon. So every country in East Asia, out of self-preservation, will have no choice but to adapt to that reality.
Because doesn't Japan doesn't have a military now. It's the United States. I think wasn't it part of the peace accord with them?
They have a self-defense force, so they have a military, but it is limited. They don't have any nuclear forces, for instance. They've had various limitations. I mean, basically, even a country like South Korea has a robust military. Okay, but only within the context of their cooperation with and their alliance with the United States.
Right.
That's the only thing that allows them to sit right next to communist China and be a free and independent country. If the Chinese eat Taiwan and we watch, you can't look at the South Koreans, the Filipinos, the Thais, the Japanese the next day and expect that they're going to look at you and they're going to be like, okay, I get it. There's a new kid in town, and basically everything west of Hawaii is going to be one way or the other under the domination of the communist Chinese.
It becomes a Wild West.
Yeah, and to be clear for folks listening to me, I'm all about us not getting dragged into every conflict in the world. I think we've tried that. I'm all about America first, and let's be a lot more rigorous in our analysis. I'm just saying you can't let the Chinese eat Taiwan.
This goes back to why having a strong military, a strong country, less narratives, less ideologies, where, hey, look, we've got a military, we have a leader who's, when we have a leader that's strong and presents a signal of strength instead of weakness, the rest of the world kind of operates a little bit nicer. The rest of the world kind of goes, okay, we're gonna do a few little things over here, but we're gonna leave
and
you
you
all alone.
probably end up in less conflict, right? everybody's heard Teddy Roosevelt's axiom. He put it a number of different ways, but basically speak softly and carry a big stick, right? When he was president. Right. Okay. And everybody focuses on the big stick part, and Teddy was a tough guy and he was going to. Okay. But the first thing he said was speak softly. So it was not a prescription for let's go spoiling for a fight. Let's go try to get into conflict. The first thing he was saying was, try to see if you can talk your way out of it. Try to avoid conflict. Just when you can't, if you got to hit somebody, you better hit them hard because
the big stick.
That exactly, that's the deal. But he wasn't really saying let's run around the world
with our big stick and beat everybody up.
Fights. He was just saying, and in fact, if you've got that robust military, as you just suggested, people are a lot less likely to push you. They understand, okay, this is a bad idea. It's not going to end well for us if we start this fight with the United States of America.
So tell me, what are the thoughts? Does China stop with Taiwan if they go into Taiwan? Is that a stopping point for them? Or are there thoughts that they would just keep on going and take over other little small islands around it?
The policy of the Chinese Communist Party is to become the dominant power on the face of the earth, straight up. There's no ambiguity about that. They don't.
So if we let them have Taiwan, then they just keep on moving.
They will, in one way or the other, keep on moving, and every country will be forced to deal with that. So, the Filipinos left to their own devices, God love them. I don't mean this as a sign of disrespect. If they just watch Taiwan have to knuckle under to the Chinese, they're not going to say, bring it on, man. They're like,
right.
If we're on our own face to face with the Chinese Communist Army and Navy and Air Force, we don't have a prayer. The other thing people should understand about Taiwan is it doesn't have to resolve in terms of an actual invasion. Taiwan is completely dependent effectively for food and energy from outside. They bring in all their oil, they bring in all their food, basically. I mean, certainly virtually all of it. Therefore, the population is completely dependent upon that. So all the Chinese communists have to do is impose a blockade. All they have to do is put ships. They have ships around the island all the time anyway. All they got to do is start getting on the radio and announcing that there's a blockade turnaround. Well, merchant ships are not running past a warship, right?
Right.
You're not taking your oil tanker and seeing if I can make it past the destroyer.
Exactly.
You're turning around. As soon as they announce it and intercept a few ships, there will be a blockade and a clock starts. And you got about maybe 60 days, maybe 90 if you're really lucky, till Taiwan has to surrender. So in that case, what does that mean? Well, the Japanese are not coming on their own. The South Koreans are not coming on their own. Nobody will come without the United States, right? A lot of people might join you.
Right.
But the first deal is, what are the Americans doing? Because the Americans aren't going. I'm not going to that party. So think about anybody listening to this, what you think the odds are that Joe Biden is ordering the 7th Fleet to fire on Chinese ships and break a blockade of Taiwan.
Not at all.
Like zero.
So Sam, I know we just have a few more minutes, and I want to get a few more questions out before, and I want to finish up with where people can find out more about your information on your Substack. But I think that one of the things that's causing problems in America is that Americans get distracted by the shiny objects. They get distracted with conspiracies, although we're finding more and more these days that some of the conspiracies weren't actually conspiracies when you find out that some of this stuff is really happening. What do you think are the shiny objects, and what do you think are the actual conspiracies? And, from a retired CIA guy, what kind of information can you shine the light on that kind of gives light to, are Americans really being distracted by a conspiracy, or are there some facts to it?
Well, I
say that what comes to your mind,
like you just suggested, that there's a lot of stuff that's happened over the last few years that you wish was a conspiracy theory, and unfortunately is real. I mean, election interference and ongoing efforts to prevent the current president's chief political rival from even being able to run for office, and just manipulation of intelligence. The single biggest thing maybe this is slightly off point, but the single biggest thing that bothers me is I think there are a lot of people who understand the country's in trouble and at least dimly understand what's happening. And they've become so demoralized that they start talking in terms of not voting, not trying. It's all over, man. We lost. What's the point? They just devolve to living online, posting things, but they're not active politically. They're not running for office. They're not helping people run for office. Some of them have stopped voting. This to me is the thing that really worries me. It's like, I get it. It's discouraging and it's sometimes hard to keep moving, but if you quit, you guarantee the other guys win, right? That
Right.
doesn't make any logical sense to just say, well, I'm going to hand them the victory. And
Right.
I say this, I do a lot of public speaking, and I say this to people all the time. You guys were all raised on stories of the revolution and Sunshine Patriots and people quitting and people going home. And it was all like a fairy tale because you knew how it ended. In the end, it was a happy story and George wins. Now you're starting to actually understand what that was all about, right?
Right.
Because you're seeing people around you quit and go home. Excuse me. So now you're being tested. Now you understand what it took to be one of the guys who didn't, when they called roll in the morning at Valley Forge, hadn't gone home the night before, was still there.
Well, and to your point on voting, I always tell people that say, "Oh, what's the point in voting? My vote doesn't matter." I said, "Well, look, Louisiana, we just had a governor election, and in the primary, it was a 30% plus or minus turnout." And I always tell people, when you look at even presidential elections, and less than 50% of the electorate is turning out, what makes it ineffective is the ones counting the votes realize that the American people aren't paying attention. They realize that they can get away with manipulation of the votes or manipulation of the machines or using ballot harvesting. They realize they can get away with it because less than 30% of the people are paying attention. So if more people get their vote, even if they feel their vote doesn't matter, or even if they're right that their vote doesn't matter, the fact that they get out and go to the voting booth and vote lets the ones counting the vote know, wait a minute, now we got 80-90% of people that are involved and interested in what's happening.
Yeah, you're 100% right, man. I mean, I say this all the time when I'm speaking too. Look, let's be brutally honest. The country was built with the idea that all of us were supposed to be involved, participating in the democracy, in the republic, all day, every day. Most of the offices were originally supposed to be part-time, and average citizens did it. And you were supposed to attend your town meeting, and you were supposed to have your hands all over this machine. And you know what? We got lazy and sat on the couch and started eating Cheetos and put on the game. And for a lot of years, it was, well, somebody's taking care of that. And if I vote, like, I'm discharging my duty, if I even bother to vote, like that's right. As much as you can expect from me. That's not the way it works, guys. That's not, you're supposed to be at your county council meetings and helping people you're supposed to know who's on your county council and your state rep and your congressman and be involved and participate. It's not supposed to be done by some group of folks off somewhere else that you never see. And that's what we've allowed to happen. So all of a sudden you wake up and realize, and I put myself in the same category, I'm not exempting myself from this. Oh, wow. Yeah, they were taking care of it while we weren't paying attention, except what they were doing was not what you wanted them to do. They were breaking the system and using it for their own purposes. So you got to get it back. And I always end up by saying, people, how many years of you not paying attention did it take to get to where we are now? Now, what do you think? In 15 minutes, because you stood up and recognized the problem,
Right.
everything's going to get fixed?
Post it
No,
on Facebook.
it's going to take you a while to dig out. So get to work, do it.
Two final questions for you, Sam, and we'll wrap up. One,
Yes.
I ask everybody, what's our what do you think is the biggest threat to freedom in America? And then after that, I want you to tell people how we can find out more about you on your Substack, a little bit about what you cover on Substack, because I want people to find out more about your great information. Biggest threat on America.
Well, look, we are under assault in this country by a radical leftist Marxist ideology, um, which has taken over the Democratic Party. That is not me saying that everybody who's registered Democrat is a Marxist. My grandfather was a Democratic congressman. Plenty of people vote Democratic because they don't understand what the party stands for now, because their family always voted Democratic, yada, yada. I get it. But the folks who are driving the train, behind the Biden administration, because I don't think Joe's in control enough to personally be directing all of this. Their goal is a radical transformation of things. I mean, they are folks who are at war with traditional American family structure, our democracy, everything. So this isn't reasonable minds can disagree. This is, do we have a republic and do we have a country or not? I mean, or do we just let them take it? So that to me is the biggest thing. And you have to understand, people need to understand that and need to get involved. In terms of finding me, the simplest place to find me is at andmagazine.substack.com, which is our online magazine. But I'm all over the web on social media, but And Magazine will take you to all of those places.
I love it. Sam, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for going over a few minutes with me. I really appreciate it. And I hope more people look you up, because when I had a chance to meet with you last time in DC and realize the value of your information and the quantity you have of that information, I think more people need to go to your Substack and find out more about it. I'm going to close out. Hang on 1 second, please. I want to tell everybody, please, if you know of somebody that might be concerned about America and needs some more information, please not only share this interview with them, either the podcast or the Rumble version, but also go to Sam Faddis's Substack at andmagazine.substack.com and check it out, because I think you'll be shocked when you hear and see all the great information he has. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night.